Florence was loud and messy. Bells clanged, merchants haggled, sawdust from endless workshops filled the air. But what if I told you that the future of modern banking, engineering, perspective in art, and even ideas about political power all came from the same crowded medieval streets? Florence wasn't just beautiful, it was engineered for creativity. Merchants, artists, and rulers all mingled in a city no bigger than a modern suburb, yet its innovations laid the foundations for the world you know today. The question is, how did one place manage to ignite so many revolutions at once? Tonight, let's slow things down and unravel the quiet brilliance behind Florence's Renaissance. Welcome back everyone, so glad to see you again. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like, comment where you're tuning in from, and what your dream is in life. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. You wake up to the sound of the Arno pushing along its banks, a rhythm that's been steady since the Romans. Wooden shutters creak open as you lean into the morning air, cool but already flavoured with smoke from bakeries placing their first loaves in the oven. The scent mixes with the oil lamps burning low, a reminder that Florence wakes slowly, rather than all at once. Below you, apprentices race through narrow alleys clutching boards and sketches. Their masters will not tolerate late arrivals, not in a city where reputation and precision decide whether your household eats well. You step onto the stone walkway, and the quiet of the shuttered room is replaced immediately by a wall of noise. Stall vendors shouting over each other, donkeys dragging carts with uneven steps, and the sharp metallic ring of hammers meeting steel inside the blacksmith's corner. The distant bells of churches fold all of it into a steady frame. As you walk, the cobblestones are slick and uneven. Horses leave their mark in more ways than one, and the stink of it lingers stubbornly between the walls. But turning a corner, you trace the aroma of bread again. Oily, flat loaves heated fresh from the fire, and it pulls you toward the market square. Here, colour floods your senses. Wool in every shade hangs from lines stretched across stalls, while merchants bicker about prices in tones sharp enough to rattle even the saints painted above them. A woman selling olives slaps away a boy trying to taste one without paying. Coins clink, hands exchange, bargains fly. It looks chaotic, but the system runs deep. Guilds check everything. Who sells, what tools are used, what standards must be met. Freedom exists, but only within structures tight as the stone walls you live inside. You feel the rush when passing painters grind minerals into powders for their palettes, or when metal workers haul in designs for strange machines. Every corner whispers a new idea, a detail that could inspire. But the drive comes with pressure. Commissions keep you afloat, and without one you're just another name begging a patron to care. Wealthy families throw coins into art, but their money demands loyalty. You're not free to sketch only what keeps your curiosity alive. If a banker wants his portrait to look as grand as Caesar, you comply, trying your best to squeeze innovation inside the limits of his vanity. Florence shines, but the grind never lifts. Guild life is a ladder without end, where rules box you in but also push you upward. Somebody must verify the stone, check the pigments, ensure a contract holds. Days fill with errands just as much as quiet brilliance. It is easy to imagine the city as a painting itself, a blend of perfection layered with smudges of obligation. You walk through it as both artist and businessman, always measuring, always negotiating. It's this constant hum that breathes life into your pursuits. Without the din and strain, innovation wouldn't crack through like it does. When pressed against limits, Minds scrape against stone until sparks appear. Even a small walk through the neighbourhood can gift you new pigments, glimpses at geometry, or overheard arguments about philosophy that reroute entire projects. You don't have to chase invention. The city tosses it into your lap daily, wrapped inside noise and sweat. Each wall looks temporary. Frescoes appear on surfaces that yesterday were blank. Drapes of wool hang and then vanish, replaced by new colours. Marble blocks arrive on carts and hint at what they might become. Nothing holds still, and so Florence itself feels like a workshop, the largest of them all. Its bricks, bells and bridges are tools. Its people are hands touching, reshaping, arguing. The ordinary day is extraordinary because the current never lets you stand idle for long. And while this looks like chaos, it's an engine running with perfect disarray. Art grows not out of calm, but the tension between need and imagination. Commissions drive your income, but also give you excuses to chase science inside sketches, to design machines no patron will ever fully understand, at least not yet. Guildmasters scold you, but their scolding ensures everyone knows your name. Patrons push boundaries unintentionally, turning their demands into opportunities to test ideas that might change whole fields. Florence is living proof that environment shapes genius. The crowded alleys, the shouting markets, the rules and freedoms scraping against each other, all create a spark hotter than any forge. It's no grand lecture hall that sets this movement off, but the clamour of everyday life pulling every craftsman, thinker and dreamer into its orbit. Step outside, and you've already stepped inside a studio the size of a city. This rhythm, relentless and fertile, is what transforms daily struggle into something remarkable. It ensures creativity doesn't wither, but multiplies under pressure. And more than anything, this pulse creates the soil in which Florence's larger society builds itself, radical, restless, and unlike anything Europe had seen before. How does banking turn into Botticelli? Sounds like a riddle, but Florence managed to pull it off. To understand how, you need to stop thinking of money the way we do today, numbers on a phone screen or some bills tucked in a wallet. In Renaissance Florence, money was written down by hand. Columns of neat figures lined in books that smelled of ink and wax. The Medici family weren't just counting coins. They were inventing systems that few across Europe even imagined at the time. Double-entry bookkeeping where every expense had to be matched to a credit sounds boring, but it gave Florence the ability to track wealth across borders, through risky ventures, and into the very foundations of the city itself. Without that balance of numbers, there wouldn't have been balance in stone paint or music either. Here's the odd twist. Florentine bankers didn't just stash their profits away. Money locked in strongboxes wasn't enough. In a city obsessed with both honour and appearances, that wealth had to prove itself in public. It wasn't enough to be rich. You had to show Florence that your fortune carried purpose. And so, money slid out of ledgers and into the streets, transforming into marble chapels, public libraries, illuminated manuscripts, and chapels packed with paintings. Wealth became performance, almost theatre, each commission letting families carve themselves into history while claiming they served the greater good. Cosimo de' Medici understood this better than anyone. He might have been a banker first, but his real power came through ideas he funded. Lending money was one thing. Funding churches, monasteries and art projects made him untouchable. Imagine a city where your personal library became bigger than some universities, and where a single building you paid for could tilt politics in your favour. Cosimo didn't just buy artworks. He wove himself into Florence's soul through them, proving to his rivals that numbers on a page could cast shadows taller than towers. His strategy wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was more like planting his name across the landscape so that anyone walking through the streets would remember who kept Florence alive and fed during lean years. But money also created risks. You couldn't launder your wealth through art unless you were willing to take chances. Sometimes commissions went badly. Sometimes artists failed to deliver. Yet bankers trained to gamble on long-distance trade routes started applying the same appetite to creativity. They bet on people the same way they bet on shipments of wool or grain. Supporting a talented but young sculptor wasn't entirely different from sending goods across the Alps. You might lose everything, but if it paid off, the returns would be monumental. The city learned to accept risk as part of daily life, and that spirit bled into every corner of innovation. This is why Florence feels like the birthplace not only of art, but of something bigger. Capitalism with ambition. These bankers were shaping culture by shaping tastes. If they wanted Florence known for piety, they funded chapels. If they wanted prestige among courts abroad, they backed elaborate palaces. And when they wanted power at home, they turned to painters and sculptors to tell stories that made their families look saintly. The result was a society where financial calculations and cultural creativity blurred so much that it's hard to separate them. Florence's art wasn't pure inspiration floating in air. It was deals signed with ink and sealed with wax. Now picture the contrast. In one room, clerks bend over rough desks, scratching with quills, chasing accuracy in columns of figures. Candles flicker, the smell of tallow and damp paper heavy in the air. Down the street, stained glass gleams as sunlight pours into Santa Maria Novella, colours painting the stone floor with red and gold. One scene is cold, rigid, exact. The other is warm, dazzling, spiritual. But both belong to the same process, money leaving pages and swelling into beauty that strangers could walk into and feel. This wasn't art for hidden chambers. It was for the public square, the monastery, the chapel. Florence proved that private wealth could scatter itself onto city walls where everyone, rich or poor, had to look up and see it. And this system shaped careers. Would Donatello have had the means to cast bronze figures without wealthy men paying to place them in courtyards? Would Botticelli's flowing mythological visions exist if bankers hadn't wanted their houses filled with reminders of elegance and intellect? Probably not. The Medici bankrolled Botticelli, not because they wanted mythology for its own sake, but because those graceful scenes told the world their household had taste, education, and sophistication. Art was advertisement, luxury branding centuries before anyone coined the term. If you lived in Florence, this pattern shaped daily life. A chapel down your street might suddenly be covered in frescoes because a local banker wanted God, or at least the congregation, to remember him kindly. A square might gain a new sculpture after a family feud needed cooling. Even manuscripts copied in scriptoria carried the scent of a patron's gold. Florence itself turned into a gallery not out of pure devotion, but from constant attempts to tie wealth to virtue. The payoff is simple but huge. Florence's greatest legacy, its painted ceilings, marble figures, and stone cathedrals, wasn't funded by abstract taxes or royal decrees, but by private capital flowing out of counting houses. Banking somehow became the soil for masterpieces. By risking fortunes and channeling them into visible work, wealth transformed into cultural memory. That strange alchemy is the reason we still stand in awe before buildings and paintings that would never have existed without the discipline of cold ledgers. So the next time you hear about paintings hanging in Florentine halls, remember they started life as ink marks in a banker's notebook. Those quiet records, balanced line by line, exploded into works that seemed to break free of gravity itself. And gravity is exactly the problem at hand, because Florence soon faces a challenge too huge for money alone to solve. A cathedral whose empty shell demanded a dome larger than anyone believed stone could hold. Picture a cathedral that stood for decades with a gaping problem no one could fix. Its body was finished, its marble facade rising, its nave echoing with prayers, but above it all there was a giant hollow space where a dome should have sat. Florence had built itself the grandest church in Italy, but they left the roofline hanging open, naked to the heavens, for almost a century. People stared at that vast circle of stone and wondered if it would ever be closed. It was like having a trophy cup without the lid, embarrassing for a city that claimed it was the cultural jewel of Europe. The space waiting for the dome wasn't a normal gap. It was wider than anything dared since the days of ancient Rome, since the Pantheon was poured in concrete and left to awe emperors. But Florence didn't have Roman concrete or imperial coffers. What they had was ambition sharpened into arrogance. The citizens weren't content with copying Rome on a smaller scale. They wanted bigger. The crossing of Santa Maria del Fiore stretched so far across that no wooden scaffolding on earth could safely span it. Builders had no way to support the bricks from below as the dome went up. Whenever engineers discussed it, they shook their heads. Lifting a roof that size should have been impossible. It was almost designed to be unsolvable. Enter Filippo Brunelleschi. He wasn't the obvious choice. Some people thought he was brilliant. Others thought he was unhinged. He trained first as a goldsmith and metalworker, not an architect. When he put forward his plan to cover the cathedral, more laughter greeted him than agreement. He proposed not one dome, but two. A double shell, thinner inside, heavier outside, with space in between to cut weight and add strength. He promised he could build it without wooden centering, without the forest of beams everyone assumed essential. Nobody believed him, yet Florence was desperate, and desperate people gamble. Brunelleschi got the nod. His methods were strange but carefully planned. He invented new hoisting machines just to get materials into position. Picture oxen walking in circles around giant wooden drums, ropes creaking as they lifted stones hundreds of feet in the air. To keep bricks from sliding while the dome rose with no scaffold beneath, he used a herringbone pattern, offset rows interlocking like fish bones, each brick leaning into the next. It distributed weight sideways as well as down, locking the structure like a puzzle you could never pull apart. Workers didn't always trust it, but layer after layer showed it held together, rising higher without collapse. Crowds gathered daily to watch. Imagine standing in the piazza, market chatter behind you, and looking up as this impossible shape climbed into the sky. No beams crisscrossed the opening. No visible support held the curve. It just grew, brick by brick, whirls of terracotta spreading like a giant shell, daring the heavens not to fall on their heads. People gawked, prayed, muttered that no mortal man should manage such a feat. Yet day after day, the red dome swelled above Florence, dwarfing towers, dwarfing palaces, until it seemed the entire city revolved around it. The moment it closed at the summit was more than architectural success. It was existential proof. Florence had pulled off what Rome itself hadn't tried for ages. They didn't just complete their cathedral, they beat antiquity at its own game. The triumph wasn't silent either. Every city-state in Italy knew about it. Visitors came to marvel and went home whispering that Florence had cracked the code of engineering for the modern age. Soon masons across Europe copied his ideas, blending double shells and herringbone systems, borrowing his cranes and winches. The dome became a new alphabet of engineering, a language others rushed to learn, but Florence gained something beyond publicity. With that dome crowning their cathedral, the citizens walked taller. The silhouette became their badge, their skyline stamped with boldness. Every merchant doing business abroad could now boast that their city built what no emperor dared. That confidence seeped into art, politics, and self-image. If Brunelleschi could close the sky with bricks, then maybe painters could open a wall into 3 dimensions. Maybe leaders could bend politics towards stability. Maybe human ingenuity itself carried no ceiling. It's easy now, centuries later, to walk inside Santa Maria del Fiore and stare until your neck aches. But try to place yourself back in that era. Each brick laid was a scandal and a wonder. Each lift of stone tested limits thought untouchable. People half expected it to collapse, killing workers and crushing faith. Instead, it stood, still stands, higher than ever. Brunelleschi wasn't just solving a construction issue. He handed Florence the evidence that vision plus calculation beats doubt. In the process, he shifted architecture away from improvisation and superstition into something verging on modern engineering. Measured, reasoned, inventive, a profession, not just a craft. So when we talk about Florence as the spark of the Renaissance, don't think only of paintings or poetry. Think of a giant shell of brick lifted with grit and wit, rising above streets crammed with bakers, bankers, and blacksmiths. That dome was a claim made in stone. We're no longer rebuilding the past, we're inventing the future. And once you give people tools to master space, you can bet their eyes will start to ask new questions about vision itself. Which is exactly what Florence turned to next, teaching painters how to trick the eye into believing a flat wall could stretch into infinity. Imagine a city where every trade, every family name, and every coin passing from hand to hand set the direction of history. Florence wasn't just a collection of churches and stone walls. It was a living experiment where bakers, bankers, painters, and politicians all had their fingers in shaping new worlds of business and art. And the city worked on layers, 5 of them. At the very top were the rulers, those who guided or claimed to protect the city, whether they were the gonfaloniere elected for short stints, or the families who whispered behind closed doors and made sure those elections always leaned in their favour. Just beneath them were nobles, clinging to a sense of old-world aristocracy, sometimes respected for their titles, more often tolerated because they brought prestige when Florence wanted to compare itself with other proud city-states. The third group, and often the most powerful in practice, were the merchants, wool traders, bankers, and guild leaders. Their influence spread everywhere, and they controlled a system that reached across Europe. Below them, the workers filled narrow streets with rough hands and sore backs. They were the artisans, labourers, and apprentices who built Florence's structures, carved its marble, sewed its fabric, and pounded its iron. At the bottom lived peasants, far from the glow of Florence's artistic fame, toiling in the countryside, producing grain, wine, and olive oil that kept the rest alive. This layering looked tidy on paper, neat lines describing who belonged where. But life inside those stone walls never stayed that simple. Florence loved to parade itself as a republic, a place where citizens actually chose their leaders, where names entered a lottery and, with some luck, even your cousin could suddenly sit on the signoria, the ruling council. But beneath this facade of openness, power lived in the pockets of wealthy guilds and prominent families. They wrote the rules of business, signed the contracts for massive projects, and made sure the city's public face hid the fact that most hands never touched the levers of real control. If you were part of the elite, You could dominate politics while still proclaiming yourself a defender of civic virtue. You could sponsor a church renovation, finance a set of frescoes, or endow a hospital wing, and people would praise your generosity, never mind that your name just happened to appear carved neatly into the stone entrance. The workers and peasants might see you as a noble protector of Florence, when in truth you were simply buying favour and reputation. Pretending to act for the common good while securing family dominance may sound familiar even today, but in Renaissance Florence it was dressed as patriotism and duty. Guilds made it all possible. The wool guild, the silk guild, the bankers, the stonemasons, they laid down regulations governing wages, training and product standards. For the common craftsman, this meant protection from fraud and unfair competition. But guilds also acted as political machines. To have a say in government, you had to be a guild member. While that offered ordinary citizens a way to participate, it also closed doors to anyone outside this system. In a way, guilds kept the city balanced, preventing total domination by one man, while still forcing allegiance to an economic order that favoured the rich. They made sure rules existed for everyone, but those same rules quietly benefited the powerful who wrote them. Elections themselves carried an odd sort of theatre. Names were literally drawn from leather bags to show fairness and transparency. Imagine it. A crowd gathered, officials fumbling inside with solemn faces, names pulled out to decide who would hold office. The tension must have been thick. Yet everyone also knew whispers of manipulation hovered nearby. A family with enough influence could predict outcomes, pushing rivals aside through quiet deals struck in back rooms. Outwardly, Florence excelled at display, processions, oaths, the ritual of appointment. But behind curtains, money and alliances shaped who mattered far more than random chance. The strangest part? This messy system actually worked. At least it worked in producing both conflict and creativity. Unequal power fueled frustration among the lower ranks, leading to riots when tensions snapped. But those very clashes forced reforms, new practices, and inventive ways to keep order. Ordinary workers demanded greater rights, while bankers scrambled to ensure their dominance without sparking rebellion. This constant push and pull meant Florence was never still. It was unstable, sometimes violent, but also flexible enough to produce innovation. What you get in Florence is a prototype of self-government that is chaotic yet groundbreaking. Laws existed to spread power, but families twisted them. Citizens felt involved, but never too involved, always kept one step from real rule. It was not pure freedom, nor complete tyranny. Instead, Florence engineered something between the two, a lab in which people tested how republics could function in practice rather than in theory. And from those experiments came thinkers who began questioning what power and liberty actually meant. That tension between ideals of liberty and the reality of control fed the mind of men like Machiavelli, who grew up watching it all. He saw firsthand a city that loved to declare fairness while practicing strategy behind the scenes. He learned that competition, secrecy, and the balance between fear and loyalty all mattered, because he had lived in a system that embodied them daily. Florence taught him that freedom and power never sit easily together, and that whoever tried to manage both eventually needed cunning as much as law. So Florence of these 5 layers was not merely public squares and marble cathedrals. It was living proof of a society balancing on the edge between open rule and private dominance. A place willing to call itself a republic while letting money and prestige dictate its reality. And that system, both corrupt and inclusive at once, became the backdrop the world would later study when asking how a government should function. It may have looked fragile, but in its fragility lay its genius. Of course, all this organisation and spectacle required resources far greater than markets and taxes. The true bloodstream of Florence ran deep beneath the stone palaces, away from the clamour of guild halls. The city's astonishing wealth wasn't born in its public squares, but inside counting tables, guarded vaults, and letters of credit reaching across the continent. What if a flat wall could open into deep space? Imagine staring at a painted surface and, instead of seeing saints and symbols stacked like stickers, you suddenly feel like you could walk straight into the background. That was the shock Florence introduced when it discovered linear perspective. Up until then, art didn't try to match real vision. Figures floated at random sizes, buildings tilted at impossible angles, and depth was often suggested with a shrug rather than precision. Walls filled with sacred stories looked holy, but they didn't match the way any human eye actually saw the world. Florence wasn't satisfied with that. Someone had to find a system that would lock vision into rules, as reliable as math itself. Filippo Brunelleschi, fresh from proving the impossible with the cathedral dome, stepped into this experiment. He built small panels that included carefully painted streets and arches, each designed with vanishing points that followed strict geometry. Using mirrors, he tested whether lines converged exactly where they should. Think about that. He wasn't decorating anymore. He was running controlled experiments with sight. Hold a mirror in the right spot, look at the panel, and suddenly the illusion matched reality perfectly. People who tested his setup didn't just see art. They saw proof that space could be measured on flat wood with precision as tight as an engineer's drawing. Before this discovery, painters worked with symbols. A king wasn't taller because he stood closer. He was taller because hierarchy demanded it. If a building needed to contain 5 people, it was drawn like a dollhouse. Its interior opened unnaturally wide so everyone fit. The point wasn't realism, the point was recognition. But Florentine artists were restless. They wanted accuracy. They wanted art to capture human experience as the eye received it, not as tradition had decided. So Brunelleschi's experiments began spreading like fire through workshops. Leon Battista Alberti, an intellectual with a gift for turning messy processes into tidy rules, wrote down the method. He explained that painters should imagine a grid stretching from the viewer into the distance. By following those lines, they could shrink figures and buildings logically, creating a depth that felt natural. Alberti wasn't painting masterpieces himself, but he gave artists a handbook that changed how they operated. Geometry, the stuff once reserved for scholars and architects, now belonged to painters wielding brushes and chalk. Then came the real test. Masaccio, barely in his 20s, took Alberti's rules and put them on a church wall. When Florentines walked into the Brancacci chapel and saw his fresco of the Holy Trinity, their jaws must have hung open. Instead of the flat saints they always saw, they found a vaulted space that looked like you could literally walk through the plaster and enter it. Columns receded, arches framed the scene, figures stood solid and dimensional. The wall had opened into another chamber, painted but whole. To ordinary eyes it looked like a miracle. The impact went beyond awe. Perspective changed the job description of an artist. No longer were they just skilled decorators. Now they were vision masters, people who controlled how space itself appeared to the audience. Think about the confidence required to change centuries of tradition and trust invisible lines stretching back toward a vanishing point. Patrons noticed. Suddenly they wanted their chapels painted with believable architecture, their portraits placed in realistic settings, their stories framed as though they happened in recognizable space. The demand for perspective trained entire generations of apprentices. In workshops across Florence, apprentices literally drew lines across wax tablets or scratched them on boards. They measured grids, practiced shrinking figures by ratio, and traced geometry again and again until it became second nature. It wasn't glamorous work. Hours bent over chalk dust and slate, drawing cubes and stairs, practicing how a window looked from above or below. But these drills gave Florence an army of painters who all saw space as something to be plotted, not guessed. Every brushstroke carried math inside it, even if the final viewer never noticed. Slowly the practice left Florence. Visitors brought back sketches, young painters carried Alberti's book abroad, and within decades perspective appeared in cities from Urbino to Antwerp. What seemed like a local trick became international. By the time the Renaissance pushed north, illusion of depth was standard. Flat medieval icons looked dated next to dazzling works that seemed alive. A revolution in vision had escaped its birthplace, carried by the hands of wandering artists and the notebooks of mathematicians. And this wasn't only about art. Once people knew that grids could create depth on walls, they applied the same thinking to other problems. Mapmakers started using perspective to chart landscapes accurately. City planners used similar geometry to imagine streetscapes and fortifications before the first stone was placed. Even stage designers for theatres stretched their backgrounds with false depth, so audiences felt drawn into the play's world. What began as a painter's discovery rippled outward into science, travel, and entertainment. The grid became one of Florence's greatest exports. Imagine standing as someone in the early 15th century, watching this unfold. Centuries of accepted visual tradition just collapsed in front of you. What looked right yesterday now looked crude compared to these new images. It was as if humanity had put on glasses for the first time and realized the world carried depth all along. And that shift wasn't mystical. It was systematic, recorded and taught. For the first time, vision itself became something humans could manipulate with logic. When you think of revolutions, you might imagine battles or new governments. But Florence sparked one with chalk and straight edges. It rewrote how humans picture reality, trading faith-based imagery for observed geometry. This wasn't just art changing its clothes, it was the birth of a modern way of seeing. A wall turned into a window, and with it, the whole of Europe began looking at the world differently. This was Florence's gift, an invisible code written in vanishing points and measured ratios. That code didn't just shape paintings and frescoes, it laid the groundwork for how we still render three-dimensional space on flat surfaces today. Computer graphics, architectural drafts, city blueprints, even the maps glowing on your phone screen all trace their roots back to this moment where artists first dared to align bricks of colour with lines of geometry. And once Florence had given its people a new way to see, ambition only sharpened. Because if lines on plaster could bend sight itself, then competition between those who mastered such tricks was bound to explode. The city, already tense with pride and rivalry, now had a visual arena where prodigies would battle for dominance, each trying to stretch vision further than the last. Imagine two prodigies waking up in the same city, both convinced the world could be remade through their hands alone. Florence had already given Europe new visions of space and beauty, but now it played host to a rivalry that would twist the meaning of genius into something almost gladiatorial. On one side you had Leonardo, endlessly observant, forever scribbling notes about bird wings and human anatomy in the margins of his sketches. On the other, Michelangelo, who seemed less interested in the subtlety of science than in hammering raw stone into gods that looked like they might leap down and flatten you at any moment. Both men wanted Florence to remember their names, and Florence, hungry for spectacle, made sure their competition was anything but private. Patrons in the city thrived on rivalry. They loved seeing artists scramble to outdo one another, because each contest gave them better art for their money and more prestige for their families. Florence didn't treat artworks as quiet objects. It treated them as weapons in a civic display. Who had the best sculptor? Who funded the most dazzling painting? Which palace courtyard could boast the most breath-stealing decoration? Behind every commission lurked politics, reputation, and bragging rights. The city was a chessboard, and artists became pieces moved by wealthy hands. Into this environment Leonardo and Michelangelo stepped, both aware that every stroke of a brush or hammer of a chisel wasn't just for beauty, it was for dominance. Leonardo's approach was patient, observational. He would spend hours observing how light reflected off rippling water or how veins branched under skin. He sketched countless machines alongside his paintings, as though the inner logic of the cosmos had to be revealed before art could take shape. Michelangelo, by contrast, had little time for such patience. He attacked stone, as though divinity lay trapped inside and could only be freed with force. His figures loomed larger than life, every muscle clenched, every outline sharp. Where Leonardo quietly dissected the mechanics of expression, Michelangelo declared that strength itself was beauty. These two visions collided like storms in the same sky, and Florence, standing beneath, relished every clash. The rivalry wasn't hidden. Both men were placed in direct competition when asked to produce vast works for the same civic projects. Rumours spread quickly in taverns and markets about which designs were more daring, or whose sketches promised bolder outcomes. Crowds lingered outside workshops, hoping to glimpse a canvas in progress, or to catch an argument spilling outside into the alley. You can imagine the excitement. Two of the greatest minds on earth fighting for one city's honour. Their quarrels turned into Florence's favourite public spectacle. But rivalry isn't just about keeping score. It squeezes harder than praise ever could. When Florence asked both men to submit drawings for city walls, each artist knew the other's work would be studied beside his own. That pressure forced innovation, because no one wanted to be remembered as the loser. Leonardo pushed his experiments in anatomy further, wrestling to capture movement as if his paintings were living, breathing creatures. Michelangelo went deeper into sculptural form, exaggerating detail and scale until his figures seemed to embody human will itself. Without this tension, it is doubtful either would have reached such radical brilliance so quickly. Competition acted as a fire under both, and Florence kept the flames roaring. Workshops reflected the same hunger. Apprentices trained like soldiers, each desperate not to lag behind in a city where mediocrity meant disappearance. Innovations by one master spread rapidly as every young student tried to adopt and twist the methods into something new. Fail to innovate, and you were simply forgotten. Workshops became factories of originality, full of chalk, dust, and sweat, where rivalries echoed even among teenage apprentices sketching late into candlelight. It's worth remembering that Florence treated artists like celebrities. Their names carried weight in public discourse, their works judged not only in private chapels but on city streets, in open plazas, on the walls of civic buildings. Crowds debated their talents almost like sports fans dissecting matches today. A passed-around sketch could start arguments, and conversations in markets carried gossip about what project Leonardo might abandon next, or how Michelangelo was tormenting his assistants. In this way, the city itself became a stage, with artists as the main characters and everyone else caught up in the drama. The rivalry often felt dangerous. Leonardo's perfectionism clashed with Michelangelo's raw defiance, and the possibility that feuding egos might tear projects apart always loomed. But danger also bore fruit. Without it, Florence may never have seen works scaled so large or imagined so boldly. The question hung in the air. Would these competing geniuses destroy themselves under the weight of pride and scorn? Or would their tension lift art to heights beyond what a single mind could achieve? We know the result. Out of this ceaseless competition emerged works that still anchor global culture. Michelangelo's David became a symbol not only of Florence, but of human possibility carved triumphantly out of stone. Leonardo's scraps of experiments, the studies of flight, motion, anatomy, fueled a vision of art fused with science, reshaping how later centuries understood both. Their rivalry didn't end peacefully, but peace wasn't necessary. What mattered was the acceleration. Each forced the other skyward, pulling standards along with them, dragging the city into levels of achievement unimaginable without their shared presence. Florence was proud of its inventions, its guilds, its finance, but nothing sparked the collective imagination quite like watching giants fight in marble and paint. Rivalry in the streets translated into masterpieces on walls and in plazas, and the memory of that tension still clings to the city today. These weren't battles fought with weapons, but with vision. Contests that never truly ended because the results remained standing centuries later, daring every new painter, architect or sculptor to measure themselves against standards set by two men who could tolerate nothing less than immortality. And yet, Florence was not only defined by the bold strokes of men wielding chisels and brushes. Its Renaissance pulse also ran through quiet networks and salons, shaped by those whose presence didn't always dominate frescoes or statues, but whose influence still altered the city's fate. Their role, though much less visible, carried its own weight in how Florence grew, survived, and remembered itself. Florence wasn't only tuned to the rhythm of men hammering marble or scratching geometry into sketchbooks. There were voices and hands in the city that rarely appear on monuments, yet their fingerprints lie everywhere if you know where to look. Women often did not sit in council seats or sign political decrees, but the influence they carried moved quietly through households, marriages, and patronage networks. To imagine Florence as a city of men alone is to miss half its pulse. Walk past the stone palaces and crooked alleys, and if you pause long enough you start to feel those unseen threads binding the city together. Consider Lucrezia Tornabuoni. Most stories about Florence skip her name in a hurry, because she doesn't fit the easy picture of bold sculptors or arrogant dukes. But she shaped her time with steady force. She married into the Medici family, stood as mother to Lorenzo the Magnificent, and worked as a matron who understood both poetry and politics. She wrote verse that carried religious weight, but also served as cultural polish for a family always eager to show refinement. Yet she wasn't writing in a vacuum. Her words and her household projects were forms of power, signs of intellect positioned to legitimize Medici claims. At the same time, she put money where it mattered. Her patronage didn't just maintain chapels and hospitals, it acted like a glue, binding the prestige of her family with public good. And when political waters grew rough, it was Lucrezia who often mediated, smoothing conflicts with skill most men at the council table never matched. Then there was Laura Battiferri, another figure wrapped in shadows of memory but vital all the same. She lived later in the century, a poet whose work breathed classical knowledge into Florence's literary circles. Women didn't command armies or build domes, but poetry carried sharp influence in court life, and Laura used her learning to sway taste and opinion. Her verses echoed Petrarch and the ancients, placing her voice into a tradition men claimed as theirs. By mastering the same tools, she bent court culture subtly, reminding Florence that intellect and artistry had no single gender. Through her presence at gatherings and her poetry exchange between patrons, she entered the political bloodstream without needing the official permission denied her elsewhere. But here's the tension. Both Lucrezia and Laura worked inside frames that constantly closed around them. Women were hemmed in by expectations, their lives defined by property, dowries, and the rules managed by fathers and husbands. The city praised them as pious, dutiful, decorative, yet behind such labels they manoeuvred. The genius lies not in doors flung open, but in how they found passageways through walls. Power kept testing their limits. They found new surfaces to write on, new spaces to occupy where rules faltered. This invisible contest, quiet but persistent, ran underneath the loud public face of Florence. Behind every grand commission men bragged about, there were women operating silently in the background. A banker might pour gold into a chapel, but his wife often managed the household networks that kept alliances alive. She held the letters, smoothed quarrels between families, arranged marriages that tightened bonds just as tightly as mortar between stones. Walk into a palace courtyard and admire the latest fresco. The man of the house got credit, but behind the scenes his wife had helped organize the alliances, the connections, the funds to make it happen without collapse. The city showed off male names carved into marble, but female guidance steadied the scaffolding. In this way, Florence's women reframed what influence could mean. They didn't smash through the walls of the council chambers, but they shaped who walked in and what decisions followed. They weren't on the cathedral dome hoisting bricks, but their money and networks ensured the workers were fed, the contracts paid. Sometimes they appeared as poets, sometimes as patrons, sometimes as mothers threading political agendas into their sons' futures. Logbooks may not record those moves, but cultural memory holds the truth. Florence was as much theirs to maintain as any man's. You can imagine the strange duplicity of life then. A woman might be treated as property in legal records, her dowry measured like livestock. Yet the same woman could shape which artist a family sponsored, influence which alliances stayed secure, dictate household strategies that echoed into civic spaces. In plain view, she seemed restricted, but from behind curtains she acted as a steady hand guiding choices with long consequences. To say Florence was propelled only by its famous masters is to pretend the city had no hidden gears turning under the surface. The gears were there, and many belonged to women. This balance also influenced how the city remembered itself. Take Lucrezia again. The verse she wrote remained part of Florence's cultural fabric, tying religion and politics together in lines that spoke dignified devotion while defending Medici presence. Or Laura, whose poetry infused courtly exchange with an aura that polished Florence's intellectual glow for outsiders. The unseen turned visible through words, through works fostered inside households, through the whisper and influence of gatherings, where women's opinions guided taste even when silenced in public law. Women in Florence weren't merely background. They gave the city another dimension to its Renaissance engine. Without them, the Medici's influence would have fractured earlier, alliances might have snapped, and networks of patronage that birthed great art could have collapsed. Their roles don't shine from statues in piazzas, but they laced through every piazza indirectly, binding the city's social and cultural fabric. And so Florence's Renaissance wasn't carried forward by sculptors and architects alone. It lived in the way women carved subtle channels of power, reshaped households into centres of diplomacy, and filled the gaps left open by official structures that excluded them. Their reach extended not only across art and literature, but into the politics of survival itself. The result is simple yet profound. Florence's greatness was never just the product of what stood in plain sight. It was the outcome of seen and unseen actors working in tandem, men chiselling stone in workshops while women negotiated, commissioned and composed behind the scenes. Those parallel forces, one loud and public, the other measured and discreet, together ignited the civic fabric we still admire today. And with Florence balanced between art, engineering, finance and hidden influence, the city began to question something larger, something thornier. The issue wasn't only who built or painted, but how power itself should work, how stability could ever be achieved in a republic so restless. Out of this swirl came one of Florence's most unsettling minds, a man determined to reduce all that chaos to rules, however harsh those rules might sound. Out of Florence's political chaos stepped a man who decided to put everything into blunt words, Niccolò Machiavelli. You've probably heard that name tossed around whenever someone talks about scheming or ruthless politics, but in his own city he was just one official trying to stay afloat in a storm of coups, exiles and betrayals. Florence wasn't gentle with him. One year he was working in government, drafting letters, leading diplomatic missions, and the next he was tossed out, accused of conspiring against the Medici. If you lived in his shoes, stability wasn't something you trusted. It never lasted long enough. Imagine being paid to serve a republic that kept imploding on itself. Florence liked to parade around with the word freedom, tossing out titles like gonfaloniere and running elections. But behind the pageantry, you knew that families like the Medici pulled strings, masked alliances, and were never really gone even when officially exiled. Machiavelli saw them fall, saw them return, watched friends betray him, and probably wondered if morality fit into any of it at all. When the Republic collapsed and the Medici took power again, he ended up arrested, tortured, and cast aside. So when he sat down to write, he wasn't some comfortable philosopher in a library. He was unemployed, out of favour, stewing over all the lies and sharp turns he had witnessed. That's the soil the prince grows out of. It isn't a book meant to soothe, it's a guidebook dripping with the frustrations and calculations of a man who knew how quickly politics could eat you alive. Reading it feels less like theory and more like notes scribbled during a street brawl, each page whispering, "Here is how you survive when everyone is out to get you." He wrote candidly about power not being built on virtue alone, but on control, even manipulation. To him, being loved was ideal, but being feared was safer. You can see how Florence taught him those rules firsthand. When you live through Republican experiments that crash and burn, and see free elections bent by whispers and bribes, maybe you start to believe that good intentions aren't enough. The irony is thick. This was a city that worshipped civic virtue and paraded statues representing justice, liberty, and holy devotion at every festival. Yet out of all that, Machiavelli delivered a handbook on how leaders could bend or break appearances when survival required it. He wasn't mocking Florence, but he wasn't blinded by its rituals either. He looked straight at the contradictions. Liberty proclaimed in public, domination practiced in private. It shaped his brutal clarity. Leaders didn't need to be saints. They needed to endure. And if that meant cunning, masks or intimidation, then so be it. For someone like him, Republican ideals were always in collision with family dominance. The Medici weren't the only clan flexing their muscles, but they were the most successful. Machiavelli lived through their return, knew what it meant for anyone who had backed the old republic and adapted. His writings boil with that tension, caught between a nostalgia for civic freedom and the recognition that families, wealth, and reputation could control every lever of rule. To him, politics wasn't a battlefield of ideals. It was a chessboard where the most prepared, the most pragmatic survived the longest. That's why his insights live on, centuries after his ink dried. Leaders still pick up the prince when they want to justify hard choices, when they want to remind themselves that image can matter more than substance, or when they need to reassure themselves that ruthlessness can work better than kindness. Diplomats refer to him when talking about alliances based less on trust and more on calculation. Even in modern boardrooms, his advice about leadership, appear merciful but keep your claws ready, still gets quoted, usually by people who've never even touched the original book. He became the shorthand for strategy in a world that doesn't play fair. And yet, pause on the irony again. Out of Florence, a city that gave the world domes, paintings, poetry and music, came a manual on manipulation. A place that once prided itself on liberty produced the clearest explanation of why liberty fails. It almost feels like a joke history played. A city dressed up in banners of virtue ends up remembered for the sharpest mind, explaining how easily those banners can be torn down. If Florence was a laboratory, then Machiavelli's notebook was its toxic analysis, written without illusions but with perfect honesty. Could good governance ever be stable here? That question must have stalked him through every coup, every whispered plot, every parade announcing stability that only lasted a season. Florence seemed to circle endlessly between republican dreams and family dominance, never managing to balance both. Machiavelli put that frustration straight on the page. He didn't flatter his city. He didn't fantasize about perfect rulers. He pinned down what he saw: survival above morality, power above virtue, reality above wishful thinking, and the payoff for us is enormous. Across the centuries, The Prince remains the most famous political playbook the world has. It doesn't tell you how to be good, it tells you how to endure, how to win, how to outlast. It captures the tension that Florence lived every day, between ideals on parade and strategies done in whispers. That's why it still matters and still shocks. It reminds us that politics often runs on forces far darker and sharper than slogans. So when we count Florence's contributions, its art, its architecture, its discovery of perspective, its daring experiments in finance, we have to add one more. The city also gave us a framework for political realism, a reminder that ambition and survival always lurk under the surface of civic virtue. That ripple, no less than the dome or the fresco, still spreads out into our world. From a single city crowded with bankers, painters, and dreamers came ideas that continue to explain how power works the moment ideals fall away. Florence didn't just reshape beauty. It reshaped how authority itself is imagined, argued over, and held. Florence's Renaissance wasn't just a burst of genius locked in one century. It spread outward like ripples in water, shaping how people across Europe began to see, build, and govern. What started in those crowded Tuscan streets, markets buzzing, workshops echoing, still threads through the world you live in now. Cities follow its patterns, politics wrestle with its lessons, even your sense of visual perspective traces back to it. Florence shows how ordinary curiosity, rivalry, and vision can echo across centuries. The lesson is simple. When human ambition collides with imagination, the results never stay contained to one place or time. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. I hope you enjoyed this stroll through history, and I wish you a pleasant trip on your way to dreamland.